my background to this is I'm a political scientist who researches public opinion, voting, and the like. And the last couple of books I've been involved in writing have been about Brexit. We started this in 2015-16, and it's sort of produced two books so far, because it's a long and involved story, as I'm sure you all know. So what I thought I would do is give you a taste of the kind of things that we should think about when discussing this issue. I'll just reverse screen so I can pick up the PowerPoint. I thought it might be useful. Let's start from the beginning. We won't dwell on this too much, but it is a saga that lasts, well, in a few years, it will be 10 years. So let's start with the original issue, which is, why did Britain vote for Brexit, which I want to discuss briefly. And then, of course, we can go on to look at consequences and prospects for the future. So here's a list of things I'm going to raise. I don't need to tell you that British politics has been in turmoil since Brexit. Now, it's important to understand how we got into this state of affairs, and it reflects long-standing issues in our society over time, and it's resulted in a series of electoral shocks, unprecedented shocks actually to the system over this period of time. We'll look at briefly the drivers behind the Brexit vote in the referendum, and these have continued, and this has consequences over the last 7 years. And then we'll speculate about what is likely to happen in the future. It's actually quite difficult to separate out the consequences of Brexit, particularly on the economy, which is a major issue for people thinking about the long-term consequences, because these other two major shocks, as the economists call them, have occurred since the referendum: the COVID pandemic, of course, and the war in Ukraine. Starting point. You will have seen this before. Voting in the referendum on UK membership, June 23rd, 2016, by the countries that make up the United Kingdom. And as you know, Scotland, very Remain, 62% Remain, 38% Leave. Northern Ireland, well, not quite so much, but certainly a decisive victory for Remain. And then there's England and Wales. Wales, well, it's close, but they did vote to leave. And England, which decided the results on the grounds of it being the largest population by far, 53 to 47. And that was the overall result in the UK. So we can see the geographical spread, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Now, in our book, the first book I mentioned, it's called Brexit, Why Britain Voted to Leave the EU, published in 2017, we argued that attitudes to UK membership in Britain were driven by three broad things. We call them calculations, community, and cues. Okay, what do I mean by that? Calculations are about perceptions of the costs and benefits that voters had about membership. And interestingly enough, not surprisingly, these varied according to who are the winners or losers, or who perceive themselves to be winners or losers in the process. And broadly speaking, people who have done well tended to favour UK membership, and people who have been left behind and not done well did not. So that's calculations. But there's another one on side, communities. This is about people's social identities, particularly in relation to national identity. People have multiple identities, but there's always usually a prominent one, you know, the most important identity. And if people have an exclusive national identity, as we shall see in a minute, in England, they were Eurosceptic. But those who acknowledge multiple identities, such as being British or European even, they're different. And then factually, cues. This is about who the public listens to when they're making their minds up about how to vote in the referendum. They take guidance from people they support, and particularly politicians and political parties they trust and support, as well as experts and opinion leaders. So these three mixed together largely explain why the vote turned out to be what it was. Let me just illustrate that. It's a rather long analysis in the books, but let me just illustrate what I mean by calculations and communities. Look at this. This is referendum voting by household income from surveys that we conducted at the time of the referendum. So you've got along the horizontal line, of course, low incomes here, and then high incomes here. And what you've got clearly is the people on relatively high incomes, modest to high incomes, were Remainers. People on low incomes, poor, if your annual income was 10,000, that's poor. They were Leavers, they were Brexiters. So the calculations they were making were, if you have done well, you want to stick with the status quo, namely British membership, continued membership. If you didn't, then you might be persuaded that leaving the EU will help you. So that's calculations. In some ways, though, identities are even more interesting. This is communities. Referendum voting and national identities. This is, as I said earlier, there's a mixture of identities, but this is isolating people's most important identity. And here we are. If you feel yourself European, not surprisingly, you were very Remain, although one or two actually were Leave. But there's not many people who think of themselves as Europeans as a primary identity. Scots, as an identity, they were Remainers. The Welsh, even though the Welsh overall voted for Brexit, their identities were pointing them in the direction of wanting to remain. It didn't translate because of turnout and various other things. And then other groups, people with, people from a immigrant community and backgrounds in different cultures and so on, they were very, very likely to say Remain. And then overall British identity, if that was the primary identity, you were also a Remainer. Look at the one that was the outlier and that decided the issue, because England is so big in terms of the population, 80% of the population of Britain. If you thought you were English primarily, then you weren't a Remainer, you were a Brexiter. And that's how national identities played. Fascinatingly, all of them were Remain, except for the English. Views. One way of looking at this is, which party do you support? Because the parties obviously were giving advice on what you should do. As we know, Conservatives very Brexit inclined, although the leader of the party during the referendum, as you know, David Cameron, wanted to campaign for Remain, but he was largely ignored by his supporters and members. Labour, well, pretty much Remain. Liberal Democrats, not surprisingly, very Remain. SNP, similarly. The Welsh nationalists, the same. The Green Party, which is kind of unusual, a bit more balanced. You'd expect the Greens to be very pro-Europe, but not really. They're very varied. And then, of course, we have UKIP, which took about a relatively small percentage of the vote in 2017, but not surprisingly, they were very heavily Brexit. So the two that produced Brexit were UKIP first, but of course the Conservatives, despite their leader endorsing the campaign. So quickly, what subsequently happened afterwards? Well, it's a long and convoluted story, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but rather just summarize. Two general elections, each one very different from the other. In 2017 general election, Theresa May lost a majority and subsequently had to rely on Northern Ireland Unionists to stay in power, and they were very Brexit, even though Northern Ireland as a whole voted for Remain. And then, as we know, Boris Johnson in 2019 won a majority of 80 seats. The last European elections that we got involved in, because we hadn't left earlier, the Brexit Party came first in those elections. These took place in early 2019. Labour came third and with 10 seats, and the Conservatives came fifth. First time they've ever done that, in elections for I don't know how many years. So that was a sign of how divided people were becoming. Parliamentary turmoil followed, as you know. Government kept losing repeated attempts to try and get the European Union Withdrawal Act ratified by Parliament, to try and find out what Parliament would put up with, and they pretty much rejected everything, every combination of soft, hard, and so on. And so it was deadlock. And in the end, as we know, Theresa May resigned. Along came Boris Johnson, and he resolved the issue after winning the 2019 election with a relatively hard Brexit. Now, polling suggests that by the time of the December 2019 election, the country was pretty fed up, tired of the turmoil. And as you know, the Conservatives had a very effective slogan, "Get Brexit Done." Now, that wasn't just appealing to Brexiters. It did appeal to Brexiters, but it was also appealing to people who were just fed up with it, all of turmoil. And that was one of the reasons the slogan was powerful in that particular election. And subsequently, much debate about this, the COVID-19 lockdown, and more recently, the Ukraine war, which has affected international supply chains, has made it very difficult to estimate the costs of UK leaving the EU. In June 2022, the Financial Times estimated the loss at 100 billion, and there's other estimates about how growth will have fallen by 5%. But let me warn you, these are really guesstimates, and they're not very reliable. Why do I say that? Well, just look at this. In 2016, just before the referendum, the Treasury published a white paper forecasting what would happen to the British economy if we voted to leave in the following 2 years. So they were imagining that the vote to leave had won. This was before it took place. What would happen 2 years on, immediately after this? So it was about the short-term impact of Brexit. And it considered two scenarios, what it called the shock scenario and also the severe shock scenario, based on Treasury modelling. Quite complicated Treasury and statistical models of the economy. Okay, let's just have a look at what they forecast, but also what happened. GDP, total national income, total amount of goods and services produced. Shock scenario, it would fall by 3.6%. Severe shock scenario, it would fall by 6%. What happened? It rose by 3.4%. Not great growth, but positive. Inflation, 2.3%, 2.7%, and 2%. Well, inflation was lower than predicted, but not by much. Unemployment rate, it would rise by 1.6% or 2.4%, but actually it fell by nearly 1%. And you can see the actual numbers here. According to this, unemployment would rise by 500,000. That would be more than 750,000. It would rise, but it actually fell by 250,000. Average real wages, the wages that people take home, they would fall by nearly 3% or 4%, but actually they rose by nearly 5%. House prices, -10, -18, +5. Sterling exchange rate, which is important for the price of goods and so on, -12 in the stock shock scenario. This is the value of the pound falling by 12%, 15%, but actually it fell, but by 6%. And then finally, public sector net borrowing. That's the difference between the amount of money the government gets and the amount it spends. This would increase the budget deficit, if you like, by 24 billion or 39 billion, but actually it fell by 7 billion. What's that conclusion? I'm not saying the Treasury are lying or manipulating or whatever. What I am saying is that current modeling isn't able to model properly these very big, rare events. It's just not up to the task. So it means that we've all got to take estimates of costs with a pinch of salt. And there are also reasons to believe that the economic costs of the pandemic are much more serious than that of Brexit. This is something we investigated in our second book. Two IMF economists, Seras and Saxena, published an article in the American Economic Review. That's the top academic economic journal, as some of you will know, called Growth Dynamics, the Myth of Economic Recovery. And what they were looking at is the effect of really big shocks, not small ones, but really big shocks like a pandemic, a war, and things like that on the economies of 190 countries over the period of 55 years. They concluded that major economic shocks like the pandemic can produce large and enduring losses of economic output. We worked on this in the new book, Brexit Britain, the Consequences of Voting to Leave the European Union. And what we did, there is actually, from economic historians, data available on pandemics over a long period of time. It's a little uncertain, so it's not watertight data, but they've done their best to try and estimate what the effects were on growth and other things. And the data shows that the pandemic was the third worst for deaths across the world, this is, in 250 years. The worst one was Spanish flu, which followed the First World War, killed 59 million. I think the current estimates for deaths in COVID is about 7 million. But COVID had an immediate and significant impact, negative impact on growth. We saw it instantly. Well, not surprisingly, because people locked down and, you know, jobs ended and furloughed and all the rest of it. So it's not surprising that happened. So it means that if you're comparing these two shocks, Brexit on the one hand, COVID on the other, we think COVID was much more serious in comparison with Brexit. The fact, it should be said, that the two coincide make it virtually impossible to precisely estimate this. But think about the fact that economic growth continued to be positive between 2016 and 18, what we've just looked at, despite predictions that it would fall. And that hints that the effects of Brexit on the economy have been less than many people thought back in the day. And that's important to think about. Now, this is survey data conducted in 2021 from surveys we conducted ourselves across the country. So we're asking a cross-section of people across the country, representative sample, of what they think the consequences of leaving the European Union are in 2021. We asked them these questions in 2016, just after the referendum, and we asked them again in 2021, and it didn't change very much. But the surprising thing is that, take personal finances. The black line means that people thought 30%, the consequences for them, their personal finances, would be negative. But only 14% thought that the consequences would be positive. So twice as many thought they'd be negative. Now, to be fair, there was a lot of people who said, well, it'll be the same. But it's interesting that people who voted Brexit were conscious that they were going to lose. I'll skip immigration for a second. On terrorism, well, people couldn't make their minds up about it. 70% said it'll be the same, and they're probably right. It didn't have much to do with that. Britain's international influence. Well, as you can see again, 35% said it's going to have a negative effect. 22%, it's going to be positive. And then finally, the economy, much closer together, even though 41%, people who said the same and positive were closer together, but nonetheless, 41% said for the wider economy, it was going to be worse. The one exception in this chart that stands out like a sore thumb is immigration. They thought that the effects of leaving only 10% thought that would be negative. In contrast, 42% thought it was positive. A lot of people felt that Britain would control its borders and control immigration as a result of Brexit. And as we know now, it didn't happen. Now, this is a long-run time series taken from a website called UK Thinks, What UK Thinks. And you can look this up because they've got lots of questions over a long period. So the question is, in hindsight, do you think Britain was right or wrong to vote to leave the EU? Okay. If they thought Britain was right, they're in blue. If they thought Britain was wrong, they're in green. And then down here are the don't knows. And they're pretty much level, about 10% don't know. Okay, but the striking thing about this is, look what happened here. The people who thought it was wrong started increasing, and the people who thought it was right started to decline. So regret, this is an adjective, I suppose, describing what people think, is growing. And on the face of it, that looks like something which would encourage people who want to rejoin to raise the issue and start talking about it, even if it's, a few years off. But there is a problem with this. But before I get to that, one of the reasons why this trend has occurred is that the government's performance in handling Brexit, and this is survey data taken this month, shows just how badly people think, the whole country thinks that this has been done, handling Brexit. It's been badly handled by the government, very badly. And similarly, in the same survey, the survey YouGov asked about voting intentions if there was a general election. And as probably many of you know, Labour is streets ahead. 45% said they'd vote Labour, 24% would vote Conservative, 11% Lib Dem, and so on and so forth. Notice that. That's interesting. The Reform Party. You'll recall that the Reform Party is the descendant of the Brexit Party. They're getting 8%, about the same as the Greens. So there's a polarization going on there. And if you remember, the Greens were a bit ambivalent, according to the earliest discussion, about whether or not rejoining would be a good idea. So you've got a rump of people who are, if you like, out there. Reform, very skeptical about joining. Greens, quite a few of them are skeptical about joining. But it looks like, on the face of it, that a general election next year will produce a Labour government. And a lot of people are talking about that now, as you know. But here's the problem with raising the Brexit issue in the next general election, which I think is likely to take place in autumn next year, in roughly a year's time. It's this. Now, YouGov charts public's perception of the three most important issues facing the country. They ask people, tell us the three most important issues you think are facing the country at the present time. And this is referred to by political scientists as saliency, the importance of an issue. And this is the problem. The purple line is people who think Brexit is one of the most important issues. And look at it back just after the referendum took place. These are the dates, months and dates of the referendum. It was 65%. That was the most important issue. They were really very much interested in that, focused on that. NHS was an important issue at the time. The economy actually was down here. It's pretty low than the others. And the NHS and immigration, rather, was just about the same as the economy, about, 25% or those. Significant group, but certainly not a majority. Then what happens? Well, as you know, there's essentially a general election. And it's around here. Here we are, about here, December, about there. Look what happens. Johnson wins, the Conservatives win, zap. The Brexit issue just falls off a cliff as being important, because the perception was, well, it's pretty much settled. Boris will sort it. Actually, the turmoil subsequently raised it a bit, but then after we actually left officially, it crashed. And now, if you look at the latest polling, again, it's talking about October. Easily the most important issue is the economy. No surprise there, cost of living crisis. NHS is the second most, immigration the third, down here with perhaps 15% or slightly more saying Brexit's the most important issue. It's gone off the boil. It's no longer salient. Hence, what does this mean if Keir Starmer does win the next election? And he laid out his attitudes to the EU and to relationships between Britain and the EU in an interview with the FT, Financial Times, in September. He wanted to seek a major rewrite of the Brexit deal, which is to be reviewed in 2025 anyway. And he wants to do this if they win the next election. He told the Financial Times that he would put a close trading relationship with the EU and a new partnership with business at the heart of his efforts to bolster economic growth. Britain's trade and cooperation agreement with the EU negotiated by Boris Johnson is due for review, and Starmer said it was an important moment to reset relations. That's a quote. Almost everyone recognised the deal Johnson struck is not a good deal. It's far too thin. As we go into 2025, we will attempt to get a much better deal. However, notice what he didn't say. He's ruled out joining the single market or the customs union. And those were options debated after the referendum as possible outcomes. And why has he done that? Because he wants to avoid reigniting the turmoil over Brexit. He realizes talking about Brexit is not a winning strategy because it's gone off the boil. And there are complications with the renegotiation in relation to the European Union. They currently are wanting a review, but a cursory review, rather than a major renegotiation. And the reason is they've got a lot of problems on their plate right now. And to summarize some, well, the war in the Ukraine. President Ursula von der Leyen is heavily involved in keeping the EU united in support of Ukraine in the war. And there's already evidence of backsliding. The Poles have cut off arms supply to the country over disputes about grain shipments. And a similar problem is occurring in Slovakia, backsliding, changing their mind. So she's working hard to keep the EU on board in support of the Ukrainians. There is a threat to democracy in some of the Eastern European member states, particularly Hungary, led by the authoritarian leader Viktor Orban. He's been weakening democratic institutions, and the EU have been sanctioning this and arguing with him. And that is a sore point and a sore problem, because the concern is that it's spreading possibly to other Eastern European countries. A third thing is economic performance of the EU has been rather slow growth compared with Asian countries and the United States. So they have economic problems and seeking solutions to those which they want to focus on. So my reading is the EU is probably willing to agree a review of the Brexit process, but it doesn't want to renegotiate the whole thing. Too many other things on its plate, even though it might welcome, in a broad sense, Britain's rejoining. The last one, which is probably the highest crisis, the biggest crisis facing Europe in terms of the present political situation, is the massive growth in immigration from Africa and the Middle East. And it's taking up a lot of time and energy to try and find a solution. And as you know, the populist leader of Italy, Meloni, is very strongly inclined to oppose this and wants help from the rest of the EU to spread the load, which is a reasonable request. But the problem is a lot of countries are very reluctant to do this. So I'll come to an end and draw conclusions, which shall give us a bit of time to discuss if you have any questions. The general election will take place next year, probably in autumn, but Brexit is not likely to be a significant issue in the campaign. The aftermath of the Brexit referendum and the turmoil it produces means that all three parties have avoided making commitments to rejoin, because it's no longer a salient issue, as I said, and there's no point in a party raising it because the election will be focused on the other big three issues. There's another reason that Keir Starmer won't raise it much as well. He does not want to alienate Labour supporters in the Red Wall. These are the constituencies, of course, in the North, Lancashire, places like that, that were won from Labour in 2019 by Boris Johnson. They largely voted to leave, and they believed Johnson's point that he was going to get it done. Now, at the moment, the polling shows almost all of them will go back to Labour. He doesn't want to upset things by raising the issue of Brexit when many of those voters are left behind and still feel aggrieved about the issue and probably still support Brexit. Actually, the Conservatives are in a similar position too. They don't want to raise the issue either very much, because many of their voters in the blue wall constituencies, these are the Conservative heartland constituencies that have been falling to by-election victories by the Liberal Democrats and Labour, many of those are Remainers. And because the party is currently very pro-Brexit, it makes sense for Rishi Sunak to avoid the issue when he can during the general election. And then finally, even the Liberal Democrats, who are, as we know, the most pro-EU party, the top three, they're avoiding a commitment to join, and for a similar reason. So this issue is off the agenda. Doesn't mean to say it's off the agenda permanently, but I can't see it being an issue that faces public policy decisions as such until maybe 10 years. Two terms of office. If Labour wins by a landslide, as they did in 1997, there'll be two Labour governments following each other, maybe more, and they can't raise this again till later on in the decade that we are currently living in.